Well, the Competition Commission has been looking at how it operated at the start of the pandemic. Do you remember all of those stories? The Commission first went on the offensive. It asked you for evidence of price gouging. You might have been one of the people who sent in pictures of this. So stories about how some pharmacies started to charge huge amounts for face masks. They were given massive fines or other areas as well. The other thing the Commission did during this time was it granted what are called block exemptions for part of the health industry. This meant that hospital groups and government health sectors could basically work together to share resources when patients needed help. Normally, the Competition Commission wouldn't really want you to share resources if you're in a competitive market. The pandemic, of course, changed things during that time. Khanyisa Qobo is the Divisional Manager for Advocacy at the Competition Commission. Khanyisa, good afternoon to you and thank you for your time. Let's start with your efforts to stop price gouging. And I remember the warnings you gave as a commission, the request, send us a photograph of how the prices changed on your cell phone. How do you assess if those measures worked? It must be quite difficult. How do you assess them?
Good afternoon, Stephen. You're quite right that we did, I think as a starting point, issue warnings via the media that retailers should, curb any potential exploitative practices on their side. And we actually engaged the CEOs of the major retailers to really get them to institute pricing disciplines on their side, particularly at the national level. Of course, at franchise level, they will be dealing with cases on a case-by-case basis. We were flooded with complaints coming through all kinds of medium, social media, WhatsApp, SMS, emails, and by the end of the financial year, we were sitting to close to 2,000 cases, which is about 5 times the volume that we get typically in a year. We were able to expedite the investigations, really putting in a whole new set of measures in the way in which we did our operations. And we had 100% success rate with regards to prosecution on those matters which we were able to refer to the competition tribunal and the courts.
So in other words, it really seems to have worked. I can't remember a time when people were talking about taking their cell phone. Everyone takes their cell phone shopping, but actually making sure to take a picture. I can't imagine that you'd had many people sending photographs of their shopping to you before.
Certainly, the times, I think, called for us to respond with urgency and some innovation. And so we collapsed all rules. We actually, even from a structural perspective, collapsed the organization and had all the lawyers and economists working under one broad team, and we were allocating then cases to these teams. We had teams working on rosters 6 days a week. We forfeited all the public holidays. One of our seminal cases on Mabelehi, which we were prosecuting in the court, we had our breakthrough on Good Friday. And so we had to put in practice notes and develop new, analytical tools and get staff to essentially investigate these cases in expedited ways. Our lawyers whom represent the respondents will tell you that our requirements for responding to our information request was 48 hours. They had to produce these volumes of information and evidence, which we required quite expeditiously. So even with prosecution, the tribunal itself changed the rules to allow for fast tracking of cases. The rules with regards to filing and hearings had to change because, of course, now we were also working online. So it really was an opportunity which we are quite pleased that we were able to rise to the occasion and be able to be responsive to South Africans in that regard.
It's one thing to do the advocacy. The fines, though, the fines sent a message. The most terrible publicity there was to be fined for price gouging during that time.
Certainly. I think also in the way in which we structured the penalties and settlements regime There was some departure from the norm in that regard as well. As you know, of course, ultimately the penalties are confirmed by the competition tribunal. And so you did have, some, I think, upwards of 5 million rand for conduct that was actually quite short-lived, because in many of the instances we were able to get to the level of prosecution within a few days or a few weeks of the alleged conduct having taken place. But beyond the penalties, the settlement agreements, the donations that were made, we also required in some instances, particularly for the micro or smaller players, say, these local pharmacies in rural areas. And we also, in some instances, required refunds to customers where those, if the firms were below that threshold of 5 million, which is the threshold in the Competition Act for prosecution. But what we found, Stephen, I think, there certainly were gains with regards to investigations and prosecutions, but the block exemptions also yielded, I think, a lot of relief for those industries which had been granted these exemptions by the minister. Healthcare, is obviously one of those where hospitals were allowed to coordinate on, sharing of data, resources, hospital beds, and so on. And one of the outcomes when we did an impact assessment on the on that particular exemption, we found that, for example, the hospitals were able to coordinate and push down the price of testing from between 1,000 and 1,000 rand to 850 rand across the board. That's just one example. We obviously had also had exemptions granted in banking to allow for banks to coordinate to bring some relief to consumers who were indebted. Equally for the retail property sector, as we know, with the lockdowns, many businesses were unable to service their rental demands, and so there too,
Khanyisa, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Coordinate on these areas, and we have found that there were many gains and lots of jobs saved and businesses saved in this regard.
Khanyisa, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I do want to ask, do you think that competition policy in the future is going to change as a result of what you've learned during this particular time?
The Competition Act has recently been amended with the last provisions being promulgated in 2019 with regards to abuse of dominance. So we had new provisions there related to price discrimination, and also market inquiries. There's more powers that are now given to the authority in terms of how they get to run market inquiries. So I think, the law itself is probably adequate for us to continue doing our work. But the major lessons learned, I think, from this experience is perhaps how we carry out or how we interpret the law. And I think from our side as the authority, but also the tribunal and the courts, there's many lessons learned in terms of efficiency and how we could improve our processes.
Khanyisa Qobo, thanks very much indeed. Divisional Manager for Advocacy at the Competition Commission. Do appreciate the time. Such an interesting lesson about our society from during that time. Well, in a moment, we'll learn why lawyers for survivors of the Marikana massacre, they are calling for the recusal of a High Court judge in Joburg over what they say is a conflict of interest. We'll find out more about that in a moment.
For all your health matters